this let's go ahead and get this meeting underway. Michelle, do I need to do anything with this pop-up about the recording?
I think just push continue.
Okay. All right. This is the meeting of the Finance and Audit Committee for the Sacramento Metropolitan Fire District for Thursday, May 27, 2021. We have in front of us a consent item. Do I have a motion on that?
Mr. Chair, I move consent item.
Michelle, would you call the roll, please?
And we're just looking for a second.
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess I could second myself.
Okay.
Good job, Ted.
All right. Director Wood,
Aye.
Director Jones.
After deep and pondering thought, aye.
And I do see Director Sailors on, so she is the alternate. So Director Sailors.
Aye.
Excellent. Motion passes. And then
Outstanding.
if we could just see if there's any public comment too, please.
Thank you very much. I was just excited to get into this and hear Ken Campo again. So before we move on to the presentation items, do we have anyone who wants to speak on any matter within the district's interest, whether on or not on the agenda?
So we didn't have anyone reach out to us ahead of time, but Art, if you could please unmute everybody and give them the opportunity to speak if they so choose.
There's only 2 accounts I can see. Oh, there's one person added on. Let me check with him. Hello, attendee. If you have anything you'd like to present to the board at this time, you do have the ability to unmute yourself. Please do so at this time.
All right, I think we are good to go. And I see Director Orzali is connecting to his audio as well. So we are ready for the presentation item.
Director Orzali may have canceled the audio. Director Orzali, we cannot hear you right now. You may have to rejoin. And when the audio pops up, you will have to say to join via the computer. Because I think you canceled it and it did not go through.
All right. While Director Orzali is getting himself reconnected, Ken, why don't we hear from you? Welcome back. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back and working with the district once again. I am going to attempt to bring up my PowerPoint presentation. And while I do that, I will ask Chief Harms if he has any comments that he'd like to make to kick this presentation off.
Thank you, Ken. Directors, for me, this is, and surprisingly, this is my 5th budget that I've had the opportunity to work on coming to the district here. I think we have a balanced budget. We have a good plan for being able to move forward. For me, last year with COVID and the challenges during COVID, being able to manage during that time and now being able to roll over to what this next chapter is, I think we're in a good position. I'll jump ahead a little bit on Ken, is that I know at the end of this, we maintain our 15% reserve in there. Some of our challenges we'll hear about tonight is the liability insurance, and as we have talked about along the way, some of our pension obligations. But I think it's so important is that as we go through having really with you that 5-year plan and being able to forecast out, it is that when we get to this point, it isn't a shock, but it's our ability just to maneuver to be able to get into a position for moving forward. As Ken gets started, I do want to say thanks to Ken. He has hit the ground running. We sat today for quite a while going through the budget and discussing different things. I appreciate his expertise, his background, and his experience for being able to sit down and having just that financial eye of being able to look at to where we're at. So Ken, thank you for that there. And I'll turn it over to you to go ahead and start with prelim budget.
Thank you, Chief. And because I'm not that technologically advanced, I can only see like one person at a time while I'm sharing my screen. So if anybody has a question or would like some clarification, just don't hesitate to pop in. So with that, we'll get started. I guess first I'd just like to say in your packet, you have the draft preliminary budget message from the chief, along with the preliminary budget document itself. So this presentation will follow along with those documents that were included in your Finance Committee package. So as the chief mentioned, essentially the budget for the general fund that's being proposed for next fiscal year, that's fiscal year 2021-22, is essentially balanced with budgeted expenditures and transfers out roughly equal to those expected revenues and transfers in. And as you'll see as we go through this, we're anticipating increases in property tax revenue, GEMT, medic cost recovery, and most importantly, continuation of the IGT program and the associated revenues. You'll see labor cost increases in there as well, driven largely by pension and medical costs. And as the chief mentioned, the general fund reserve is projected to be right at about 15%, that balance of $34.3 million projected for the end of next fiscal year. I know this is kind of toward the bottom of the board's reserve policy and where they would like to see those reserves. But by the time we actually close out this current fiscal year, fiscal 2020-21, we're likely to see somewhere in an order of maybe $1 million to $1.5 million of further budget savings that hopefully by the time we get to final budget adoption, we'll see a little bit higher reserve than 15%. And one big unknown here is the results of the ongoing MOU negotiations, which could require further budget adjustments as we get into the next fiscal year. So like any fire district, property taxes are the primary source of operating funds. So here and I'm sure the board has seen this slide many, many times over the last few years. I seem to recall looking at this slide back in 2014, 2015 timeframe. But now you can see this is just a historical review of overall revenues for the general fund, and pointing out the amount of property tax revenues that comprise those totals. So you can see, going back to the pre-recession peak period of about 2008, 2009, you can see that decline in revenue and the decline in property taxes. But then starting at about 2012, 13, there's been pretty consistent, steady growth in property tax revenues, and about 11 years of continued growth in overall revenues during that time. You can see how property tax revenues were a bigger component of the district's operating revenues back in 2008, 2009. Property taxes represented about 80% of overall revenues. And looking forward to 2021, they're about 70%. So the district has become more reliant on these other revenue sources over time. And it's done so out of necessity, more than anything else. So this is just a overall summary of all of the funds. So that you have the general fund, you have the capital facilities fund, lease properties fund, grant fund, development impact fees, and the IGT fund. So those are the funds that comprise the district's operations. The general fund, of course, is the primary operating fund of the district. You can see overall revenues there of about $238 million in revenues, compared with $241 million in expenses. So that shows there's an operating deficit of about $3 million, but that's made up down below with the net transfers in of about $3 million. So we get to that essentially balanced budget of $278 million. You can see here there's a transfer out of the general fund. That's the $6 million going into the capital fund. And we'll look at what that's funding a little later on in the presentation. And here's that transfer in from the IGT fund of about $9.4 million. That's essentially what provides the balance for the general fund. So we have the net transfer activity of about $3.4 million. Again, giving us essentially a balanced budget for the year. I just wanted to point out that in the capital fund, we'll look at this a little bit later, but we have this additional funding coming in of about $6.6 million into the capital facilities fund from the equipment lease financing transaction. That really it's just now closing, and we should be funding that like I think next week is the plan. So moving on and just looking now more focused on the general fund. This is comparing the preliminary budget for 2021-22 with the mid-year for projected results for fiscal year 2020-21. We'll look at more detail as we go through the presentation. And I apologize, but I need to move my picture up here a little bit. So overall property tax revenues increasing by about 4%. So there's about a $7 million increase in property tax revenue. You see an increase in charges for services. We'll look at that in a later slide. And you can see labor costs going up by about $7.6 million. Services and supplies increase of about $3 million. Overall, the expenditures are going up at a little greater pace than revenue. So revenues are projecting up about $9 million and expenditures going up about $10 million. Again, offset by the transfers coming in. And again, we'll look at that detail as we move forward. Just quickly go through this. So this is just an overall look at the general fund projected revenues, again, showing the importance of the property taxes, the biggest component of operating funds at about 70%, and charges for services at about 24%. And you can see the operating transfers there at 9.4 million, and intergovernmental, primarily GEMT revenues at about 1.7%. So again, projected revenue for the general fund, 238 million. Overall, about a $10 million increase compared with this current fiscal year. Property taxes are going up about $7 million, as I mentioned. That's roughly a 4% increase that's projected. We'll know more about that in July. So the county assessor will certify the tax roll early July, and we'll get a better handle on just what that increase is going to be for next fiscal year. We see medic cost recovery of about 1.7 million. This is off of last year's numbers, which were impacted by the pandemic and the shutdown that occurred. We saw a decrease in calls, EMS calls, and a decrease in transports. So now we're looking to return to more of a normal cycle. So we're looking at an overall increase there of about $1.7 million compared to this current fiscal year. And GEMT revenues, around emergency medical transport, the supplemental revenue source from Social Security, primarily Medi-Cal. We're looking at about a $2 million increase there. And that's pretty much the prior 2 years to the current year. So the district receives about $1 million a year for these this additional reimbursement for these Medi-Cal transports, but those have been on delay the last couple of years. So we're anticipating a catch-up period. So the current year plus 2 prior years. So we're looking at about $2 million more than what we were and we would normally project. And again, the net IGT revenue transfer into the general fund would be about $9 million, added to the $238 million of revenues, would give the district overall financing sources of about $247 million. Of course, this is a look at the expenditure side of the equation. So on this side, labor costs represent the biggest component, which is the same for all, pretty much all public agencies that are, rely on people to provide services, right? So that's where the bulk of the district's operating costs lie, or are in the labor category. So that's projected next year at $204 million. Which coincidentally is about a 4% increase, which coincides with the increase in property tax revenue and overall revenue for the general fund. That represents almost 83% of the general fund budget. We have services and supplies in it, $32 million, next largest component. Yes, sir.
Oh, you might want to mute yourself. You're just got on.
Okay, I just heard.
Director Orzali, do you have a question?
No, sorry, I was in the middle of the phone with Director Orzali getting him on, so he just joined and he just started talking. He didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry about that.
Okay. All right. So we'll continue on. So out of that, the $204 million labor budget, that's again an increase of about $8 million compared to this current year and the updated mid-year projection. The bulk of that $8 million increase is in the required pension contributions. Those are up about $6 million from the previous year. Then we also have increases in the smaller increases in the OPEB contribution, the increase in medical premiums, both for active employees and retirees. We have a half a year wage increase. So the increase that went in on January of 2021, we have the next 6 months of that increase. We're assuming vacant positions get filled, and we're also assuming less workers' comp costs this year post-pandemic than we experienced last year. Again, as we mentioned earlier, the services and supplies budget is totals $33 million. That's about $3 million more than, I'm sorry, that should be 2021 there instead of 2018-19. So about a $3 million increase over or this current fiscal year when. $1.5 million is related to liability and property insurance. So that premium is going up significantly, primarily related to, or if that increase is being driven by these large law enforcement settlements, not only in the state, but throughout the country. And I think you'll be hearing more about that during your regular meeting. There's another estimated $600,000 increase in the Sacramento Regional Fire and Emergency Communications Center contribution. The district's share of that budget is going up by about $600,000. There's a $300,000 increase for safety, clothing, supplies, and services related to the firefighter academy that's being proposed, and about a $300,000 increase for GEMT, the statewide administration of the GEMT program, which the district does receive reimbursement from the other participating agencies. But that reimbursement is on the revenue side. The general fund also is responsible for a number of for debt service, for assessments, and other contributions totaling about $4.4 million. About half of that is paid to Sacramento County for property tax administration. Again, the $1.7 million for the administration statewide of the GEMT program, and then general fund debt service payments on lease revenue bonds is about $312,000. We talked about earlier net transfers to the general fund, about $3.2 million. We have the $9.4 million coming in from the IGT program, and then $6 million going out to the capital facilities fund. That's roughly about a $600,000 reduction from the current year. And we'll look at what that money is going toward when we get to look at the capital fund. Okay, this is the district's D fund, the capital facilities fund. This is a comparison, the preliminary budget for next year with the current year. You can see there's about a $2.2 million increase overall in expenditures, and these are all capital related. Of that, you see capital outlay there about $8.5 million. About $6.6 million of that is going to be financed through various equipment leases. And there's a carryover of about $1.6 million from last year, or from this current year we're in now, into next year that'll help offset that as well. And you see down below, issuance of capital leases, $6.6 million. And then you have the transfer in from the general fund of about $6 million. So you have total financing sources there of almost $13 million compared to the about $14.3 million of expenditures. A little more detail on those. So the net funding requirement from the general fund is about $6 million. And that's going primarily to debt service payments from the capital facilities fund. Again, we mentioned the capital outlay totals about $8.5 million. Included in that $8.5 million are expenditures for 3 Type 1 engines, about $2.1 million, 2 Type 3 engines for another $1 million, ladder truck at $950,000, then some Type 5 engines, some small brush rigs, $645,000, and a new water tender at $575,000. Okay, just quickly, here's the grant fund for the district. It looks like, there's about $1 million in additional grant revenue coming in. There's $2 million projected in expenditures. There's carryover funds from the previous year, so that this fund is really going to net out to about zero at the end of the year. So the $2 million in budgeted expenditures is really to wrap up currently open grants that the district has going. And we have the leased property fund. Both lease revenue and expenses associated with the lease properties are budgeted at about $1.1 million. There's a slight surplus of about $24,000 for this fund. But essentially, it's the revenues covering the expenses associated with these properties. And this is just a forecast looking ahead. You can see the 2021 and 21-22 years that's projected versus budget there. And then you can see going forward, the projections reflect a slight surplus building in these out years as we move forward. But I just remind the board that, or the committee, that in this particular forecast, there's no salary increases built into this at this time. So just to recap what we talked about earlier, for the general fund, the proposed budget is balanced, and it maintains the minimum reserve level of about 15%. But as we're already starting to see that the actual operating expenses are going to come in a little less than budget for the current year. So I wouldn't be surprised to see $1 million to $1.5 million surplus that will serve to bolster that ending reserve balance as we get closer to adopting a final budget for next fiscal year. And with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions that I can, or if not, then maybe the Chief Harms can help me out. But that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Ken. Anyone on the committee, anyone have any questions for Mr. Campo? Randy, are you with us? Do you want to take over? All right. We can't hear you, Randy. Director Jones, you had your hand up? I'm sorry.
No, thank you. Just in regards to those lease revenue bonds, I know on some other bonding we have, I forget the correct terminology, but when is that bond paid off? Or is this going to be, is this part of a continuing thing for lease revenue bonds? How long is that going to last?
I know one of the larger bond issues, and I can get you more specific information, but I know one of the larger bond issues is paid off, I believe, in the 2024-2025 time frame. And the financing leases, the equipment leases, those are 5-year leases. So those are like rolling 5-year lease programs. But the larger, I think it was a COP issue, a certificate of participation. That one, I believe, is completely paid off in about 2025. And please correct me if I'm wrong, Chief.
Yeah, you're right there, Ken. The biggest ones are the pension obligation bonds, and they'll be fully paid off in fiscal year 26-27. And our annual debt service on those is right in between $6 to $7 million. So, we're in 21-22. So we'll have about 4 more years of payments of that, and then that one is gone. And then, as Ken said, the lease financing are 5-year. And if you remember in the last meeting, The finance charge is less than 1% right now. So it's a good time for us on those. But the biggest ones are 26, 27 in that fiscal year.
Right, yeah, no, thank you. I wasn't aware of the 5, or if I knew it, I forgot it, the 5-year recurring lease. So thank you, Ken. Thank you, Chief.
Director, this is Ron Empedrad, Controller. I just wanted to add an additional information on the lease revenue bonds that you specifically asked. That is payable in the year 2041. We pay roughly around $600,000 every year against that debt. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, Ron, with your permission, I'll probably do a further offline conversation with you on background on that to help refresh my memory, please.
Yes, Director, you can call me at any time.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions for Mr. Campo? All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Campo.
You're welcome.
The next item, our next meeting is to be determined, but if we follow our normal course of business, it looks like it'll probably be on June 24. With that, we'll go ahead and adjourn this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then perhaps we should just stay here for our regular meeting that started 7 minutes ago. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
If
Pleasure.
that's your pleasure.